This happened to me about a week ago. So I went to this quarry in McKinney, Texas, and I will never go back there again after what happened to me. Here is a little backstory, so this will make more sense. The first time I went to this quarry, it was pretty sketchy. Me and a couple of my friends, Josh and Miles, went to this quarry for cliff jumping since we had seen some YouTube videos of people cliff jumping at it and had found out that it was only about an hour away from where we lived. Both me and Miles are old enough to drive, me being 16 and Miles being 17, so we thought it would be a really good idea to go. Once we got to the quarry, it had a really sketchy vibe to it. There was a small dirt road that led up to the quarry, which made a circle around the quarry. To the left were these ghetto-looking white buildings, which were pretty much just white metal boxes, and to the left was the fence that surrounded the rock path that led to the quarry. We drove down this road in Miles' Jeep, and there were tons of signs saying stuff like "No trespassing" or "Warning, blasting zone." And there was even this big white piece of cardboard that read, "Trespassers will be shot on sight." It is important to note that in Texas, people can legally shoot you if you are on their property, but it just doesn't really happen much. We decided to drive back to the beginning of the road where there was this gravel parking lot by an old building which looked like it had not been touched in years. Miles parked the car, and we all reluctantly got out of it and began our walk to the quarry. While we were walking, a truck drives right by us and just kind of looked at us with a blank expression on his face. Honestly, it was pretty scary when the car passed us, but the fact that he didn't do anything made us think, maybe they don't care too much if we are on their property. We kept on walking, and then we came to the fence we were supposed to jump to get onto the rock path that led to the quarry. We went to the smallest cliff jumping spot first, and saw a pretty big snake swimming in the water after the first 10 minutes of being there. So we decided to wander further down the quarry where we saw a pretty decent sized cliff, about 35 feet. After depth checking it, we spent about an hour cliff jumping there before we got bored and moved on to the next cliff. We were at the very end of the quarry and were walking down a path to get to a bigger spot when we see a black Hummer stop. The lady in the Hummer was probably in her mid-30s. She rolled down the window and yelled, "What the fuck are you doing on my property?" It honestly kind of shocked us, and I responded with saying in an innocent voice, "What do you mean? We thought this was public property." She knew we were lying straight to her face and yelled at us some more, and then she said something I will never forget. She picked up her phone and said, "John, get the gun." Me, Miles, and Josh all froze. We were scared to death. She said to follow her and drove slowly down the path about 20 feet to a gate. We decided to follow her. We were all saying that we were so sorry and that we would never come back again, and she let us go after saying, "The cops are on their way, so you better haul ass that way before they get here," and pointed towards the dirt path that led us away from her property. We told her thank you, and ran faster than any of us thought we could, and got in the Jeep and drove away. I wish this was the end of the story, but it isn't. A couple of months later, Miles asked me if I would ever go to the quarry again, and I stupidly told him, "Yeah, I guess if we had a bigger group." So, we got a group of 5 together, and went back to the quarry in my car. I drove, and after about an hour, we arrived at a church which we would be parking, about 2 minutes away from the quarry, since we didn't want the lady getting our license plate number. We walked down the dirt road and went past a few cars, and then a guy who was probably in his early 20s yelled, "Hey, watch out for the black Hummer." We walked up to him and told him the story of what happened the first time we went to the quarry, and he laughed about it, and we went back to walking down the dirt road. We jumped the fence and decided we would just go to the second spot and not any other spots, just to be away from any roads that lady could drive on. We were at the spot for about an hour when this silver van pulls up at the end of the dirt road about 25 yards away. It wasn't the black Hummer, so we weren't running away just yet, but we were just getting our stuff ready in case we had to run. When the silver van stopped, it was for the most part out of our sight due to trees being in between us and the van. We waited there for about a minute and thought the silver van was just doing something in the car when we heard 2 loud gunshots really close to us. Right when we heard those, we were all running as fast as we possibly could. It was probably 300 yards away to get off their property, and about 125 yards to get to the main dirt road. I was in the very front, with one of my friends, Aiden, right behind me, and Miles and the other 2 were a little ways behind us. I heard more gunshots about 40 yards away, and it sounded like he had shot about 8 times so far. But when I turned around, I couldn't see the guy who was shooting at us. We got to the fence and jumped it, and were now on the main dirt road, and saw the guy we had talked to earlier, who had warned us about the black Hummer. He was in a white truck, and we begged him for a ride, and he gave us a ride back to the end of the property. We thanked him and then ran back to the car. We all got in the car and drove away, never to see that quarry again. I was never very close with my father. My parents split up when I was just a baby. My father was successful and only seemed to care about working, so I only rarely saw him growing up, usually just on certain holidays. My mother gave me a great life, and I had an awesome father figure, so I never really cared about seeing my biological father. I didn't even know he was sick, so when I found out he had passed away, I was pretty surprised about it. I saw him even less in my adult years, maybe once a year, if that. When I went to his funeral, I saw some family on his side that I hadn't talked to in years. I found out that although my father had been diagnosed with cancer, he never told anyone about it, so I wasn't the only one that was surprised about him passing. A few weeks after the funeral, I was even more surprised when I got a phone call from an attorney informing me that I was inheriting the home my father owned. I guess it kind of made sense, since my father never remarried and I was his only child. I guess I never really considered where any of his belongings would end up after he died. Regardless, it was unexpected. After finding out about the inheritance, the following weekend my wife and I went to check the house out. We already owned a home, and although my father's house was a little larger than ours, it was located almost an hour away from where we both worked. I wanted to take a look at the house and eventually meet with a realtor so I could get it listed to be sold. Once we finally made it out there, we realized how large of a project we had on our hands. My father's house was still filled with all of his belongings, aside from the certain few items he had given away in his will. I decided to hold off on trying to sell it, and would focus on coming out here on the weekends to go through all of his stuff and decide what to keep, what to donate, and what to throw away. About 4 or 5 weekends in, we finally had the majority of his belongings sorted through and out of the house. The only things left were only a few large pieces of furniture. We decided we would either give or throw these items away. They were in good condition, so we contacted some local places that we thought might take them as a donation. It didn't take us long to find a place. I rented a truck and came back the following weekend with a friend of mine to help me move the furniture. While downstairs in the basement, we began moving the large bookshelf away from the wall. Once we did, I noticed that the wall behind it looked incredibly weird. Upon further inspection, it was obvious that it was a small door, presumably to a small storage cubby or something. I opened it up, and what I found was the last thing I would have ever expected. It was like I entered a flashback to the 90s. Keep in mind, this story took place in 2012. The first thing I noticed were pictures of Jonathan Taylor Thomas all over the walls of this small room. I also found a Tamagotchi that surprisingly still worked, a roll of gauze, one sock that looked unused, the Goosebumps book Say Cheese and Die, and one of those Orbitz drinks, the drink that had all those little balls of whatever floating around in it. Surprisingly, the drink and its little balls seemed to have held up over the years. There was also a stack of some newspapers and magazines, as well as some bedding items. I looked at a couple of the magazines. They were those old 90s magazines for teenage girls, presumably where the pictures on the wall came from. I really tried hard to not jump to any conclusions, but I couldn't help myself at times. Why were those items in there? Why did my dad have what I would presume to be a girl that was a teenager or even younger staying with him? And why in that room? Why did he appear to hide that door? Why wouldn't he have gotten rid of that stuff? Was he keeping it for nostalgia? What happened to the girl and where is she now? Honestly, it just added to the long list of questions I had already been asking myself about my dad for years. I decided my best bet, just to be safe, would be to report the situation to the police. Like I said, I really didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but if something messed up was going on, I didn't want to just tamper with everything. I left the room alone and reported it. Then I moved the last few items out of the house and dropped them off and went home. I gave the police permission to enter the home, as I wouldn't be there. I received a phone call from them the next day, and it literally gave me chills. They ended up going to the house, and they looked through all of the belongings a bit more thoroughly than I did. They found everything I did, but also looked through the rest as well. Underneath the magazines were a stack of newspapers. The oldest newspaper dated back to only several months prior, with the newest newspaper being from only 3 days before I last went to the house. Someone was just at that house, in that room, within 3 days of me being there. This not only terrified me, but it filled me with even more questions than before. It left me even more confused about all of those items from the 90s, or the type of person that was occupying the room. I still have these questions years later, as they were never answered. The police told me they believed the individual was getting into the house through an unlocked window. The police made sure all the windows were locked before they left, and would occasionally stop by the house to make sure all was well. I never heard anything else come from the situation. Once I received the initial call, I immediately listed the house for sale and never went back. I let the realtor handle everything from that point on until the house was sold. So, all I'm left with now are more unanswered questions. But I do always make sure that when I shut one of my windows, I lock it too. When I was younger, my friends and I had a habit of going to places we didn't quite belong. We were kids, and we never looked at it as being wrong or that we were doing something bad. We never broke anything or stole anything. We just liked to go explore places, especially places that were abandoned. Those were always our favorite. We never really considered that someone still owned these places, and we never got into any trouble either. Well, at least not until we were 12 years old. That's when our career of sneaking into places came to an abrupt end. It was a Friday night. My friends Jeff, Dustin, and I were supposed to meet each other outside a grocery store that was relatively close to all our houses. From there, we had to walk about 2 miles to the location we were going to explore. This was back when each of us telling our parents we were going to stay the night at one of the other houses still worked, so we had all the time in the world to explore. We met up at the store and excitedly made our way to where we were going. It was an old building that used to be used for some type of storage. It had sat empty for years, and we were really looking forward to seeing what was still inside. We all laughed and joked around on our way to the building. It was a nice night out, and none of us felt anything but happiness and excitement. We made it to the building and began looking for a way in. To our surprise, we ended up finding a door that was left unlocked. I want to say that this was the first time we had had that happen. Usually, we have to find a window to get in through. We got our flashlights out and began to look around. Although it was still pretty cool seeing this place, we were a bit disappointed that it was completely cleaned out. We continued to explore anyway, going from room to room, making sure we checked out the entire place. We weren't being very loud or anything, but we also weren't being extremely quiet, as we knew we were alone. After exploring the place for about 15 minutes, we went up to the second floor. We went through this floor room by room, just like the first. We eventually got to the end of the hall. As I entered the last room on that floor, I was talking to my friends. As soon as I walked in, I went completely silent. In the room, there were 3 men standing there. I remember looking at them and knew they weren't friendly-looking people. They had 2 small bags with them. I'll never forget the first thing one of the men said to us: "You kids picked the wrong building." From there, they went on to ask us questions about why we were there. We just kept telling them the truth. We just wanted to look around the place. Eventually, the men told us that if we did everything they told us to do, none of us would get hurt. We were scared, very scared. I believe all 3 of us were crying at this point. We were begging them to just let us go. Things only got worse when one of the men pulled out a gun and told us that we were coming with them. Another one of the men seemed to have more sympathy for us. He told the other guy to put the gun away. He also said that they were just going to drive us down the street and drop us off. He promised that we wouldn't be hurt at all. For whatever reason, I really trusted the guy. He just seemed like the nice one. The men talked for another minute, while my friends and I stayed quiet, aside from crying. The men picked up their bags and told us to come with them. One of the men got into one car parked down the street, while the other 2, along with us, got into another. Luckily, one of the men with us was the nice guy. During the drive, he kept assuring us that they were only going to drop us off and no one would be hurt. We just continued to keep quiet, as the other guy made it clear that's what he wanted us to do. After not even 10 minutes of driving, the car came to a stop. The man with the gun turned around to face us. We all froze in place. He looked at us and told us what each of our names were. He said he knew where we lived and knew everything about us. He said that if we called the police or told our parents or anyone else about them, he would know about it and he would come after us and our families. We promised him we weren't going to tell a soul about what happened. The nice guy gave us $20 and a handful of quarters. He told us that if we could find a payphone, we could use the money to call a cab to get us home. This happened back in 2000, so not very many people had cell phones, especially not 12-year-olds. Therefore, payphones were still really common. We thanked him for the money, trying to be polite, and got out of the car as quickly as possible. The car drove off, and we took off running. We ran and ran for a long time, before finally coming to a stop when we can no longer breathe. I know we all wanted to look brave, but it took a while before any of us could keep it together. Luckily, we only ended up a few miles from home. We preferred to walk home anyway, as we feared that calling a cab would somehow get us in trouble. We walked to Dustin's house, as it would be the easiest of the 3 to sneak into at night. Before getting there, we definitely stopped at the store and spent all of that money on candy, just a side note. We really didn't tell anyone what happened that night. We made a pact, and we stuck to it for years, As we got older, we would occasionally bring up the incident, and we came to certain realizations the older we got. First of all, I'm sure what we saw was the sale of something illegal. Maybe drugs, maybe guns, I don't know. But it seemed like a somewhat organized deal, and they went to some lengths to keep it hidden. Also, like I said earlier in the story, we weren't being very quiet inside of that building. I'm sure those men heard us right away and kept quiet, waiting to see if we would discover them. I'm sure that after 15 minutes or more of listening to us talk, they heard each of our names being said multiple times. So that guy had no clue who any of us were. He just knew our first names from hearing them. But we were 3 traumatized kids. We weren't able to pick up on any of this at the time. At this point, all of these years later, we have no problem talking about it now. We even joke about it now. But at the time, being 12, walking into that in an abandoned building with no one else around, seeing a gun, being driven to a secluded location, it was a fear that I haven't come close to experiencing again.